Hello all, and welcome to the second episode in this series hoping to bring some light into some of life's more misrepresented subjects. Today's topic is an introduction to the fundamentals of economics. It is here that we must start, because it is at the fundamental level where modern economic thinking is already subject to some gross misconceptions and odd ideas. As we don't have much time, let's jump right into it. I think you won't have any trouble following the thread of this episode. Money. Despite all of the mystical status that has been bestowed upon it throughout the ages, it is quite simply the medium of exchange, nothing more. You cannot eat it, build with it, or anything else. It has no real practical worth other than that it can be exchanged for commodities and services that are of use to the individual in one way or another. How heavily reliant the concept of money is dependent on perception cannot be underestimated. Though few will have memories of the disaster of mass inflation, they will have an inkling of its effects thanks to the constant inflation we see today, or in the massive fluctuations seen in the stock exchange and stock prices. Almost anything which is perceived as having worth can be used as a medium of exchange, such as products or gold. Money is simply the most convenient form that has found acceptance. In the modern world, where most money is in the realm of electronic ledgers and are just numbers on a screen, this has taken on a whole new level of trust from society in the ability of this useless unit of exchange to be swapped for useful physical things or services at any given time. Wealth, or how much wealth a person has always been effectively a way of keeping a score. It is a way to measure how much one person has compared to someone else, be it the number of cattle, the size of land, number of slaves, the amount of gold, or in the modern world, the amount of money, or monetary value of what they own. There are actually two ways to grow wealthier than others, either by gaining additional wealth in comparison to all others, or, much less well known, by removing wealth from all others in comparison to you. How can you destroy wealth, you may ask? Quite simply, you let existing capital deteriorate. Maintenance is a massive component in keeping most wealth intact. If we let everything made by humans rust, fall apart, or generally degrade, then there may still be the same amount of paper money or gold, there is simply less to buy, so what is left becomes more expensive. Money only has value because of what it can be exchanged for has value. If it can only be exchanged for less things of value, money, by default, has less value overall, or less buying power, no matter how much of it you have. You can also decrease the value of money, or decrease how many goods and services you can exchange a given quantity of it for, by making more of it in relation to the products and services available. In a world where circulating hard currency makes up only a small token of actual money available, where governments keep injecting fresh capital into banks to maintain liquidity while the rich hoard their cash for fear of losing it, and wherever more and more non-physical things have value, such as debt and financial instruments, that can be exchanged for their monetary worth directly, it is no surprise that physical goods and services are becoming more expensive. Inflation of commodity and service prices is simply the market realizing that there is more medium of exchange, or money, in relation to the commodities and services available, nothing more. And the worst thing is, that while the people in power bemoan the effects of inflation and claim to be powerless to stop it, it is the people in power who suffer the least because of it, because they own all the commodities and resources which just increase in price, while the average citizen suffers the most due to their reliance on saving, which are worth less and less. Value, or worth. Now this is truly the most subjective of all terms. It has led many economists to fruitlessly attempt to try and define and control it. One thing I can say is that all value is generated by society. All of society in its entirety, no less, one way or another. To explain this, I will define two broad categories: resources, or physical things, and labor. Resources. I will give an example. Resources, in their pure form, i.e. natural resources, only have value due to their limitation. If everyone had immediate, limitless access to resources, they would be worthless, because everyone has them, sort of like air, at least for now. Let's put it another way. What would happen to the property prices if the population decreased to 100 people? Or just think of the expression, like selling ice to an Eskimo. Just from the simple fact there are more of us means that resources get more expensive or have greater value. The funny thing is that the people, society, who are causing resources to become more valuable through procreation get no benefit out of it. No wonder economists are always pushing the need for a growing population, despite everyone else already knowing deep down that there are probably already too many of us here. What a fantastic way to generate the mythical interest on investment they are always after. You increase value by doing nothing but investing in resources, quite often land, let the masses populate, and watch your wealth grow. It is a simple fact that the more scarce a wanted resource is, the more valuable it is, particularly if it represents an existential necessity. How valuable would gold be if it was common? This is best shown by monopolies. These can generate, and quite often do, artificial resource scarcities to be able to drive up prices. After all, there is no alternative. A great example of this are brand names, and you thought that you were paying all that extra money for an increase in quality. Labor. Other than limiting wanted resources, or access to them, there is really only one other way to generate value, and that is by doing work to something. Let's go back to the example of scenario of infinite resources for all. The only way to add value to anything would be to do work on a resource. Invest labor to produce something with a higher use value than the raw resource alone. Or it may be the value of labor alone, a service, an idea. The bottom line is quite simply that labor is the only other way to generate value. What that value is somewhat irrelevant. In fact, a lot of products that have been worked on are quite useless and have no value at all. But the important thing to remember is that the source of all value of physical objects, other than their restriction, is labor. To help show that all generated value is in fact a combination of these two factors, let's look at a few examples in history. Through quite a lot of early history, the value of most resources was greatly reduced due to their relatively plentiful supply and a lack of population. At this stage, people were still quite valuable as a resource in their own right, and were needed to perform labor, to extract minerals, to build cities, to farm fields. Why the general population was unable to make use of this quite plentiful conditions was quite simply the threat of violence and death. It will surprise a lot of people in first world countries to know how common violence and murder was throughout our evolution. The individualism we take for granted nowadays was quite simply impractical for most of human history. Without going into long-winded details of the rise of civilization, let's just say that all systems of government can be described in one way or another simply as a type of protection racket, for want of a better term. People need to form ever larger and larger social structures to quite simply protect themselves from other societies that were doing the same. Due to the nature of society, it wasn't long before a ruling class emerged. Now there are innumerable ways that social order developed throughout history, but in one form or another, most, if not all, developed to the stage where the ruling class, through threat of violence, disinformation, or simply through a gradual step-by-step process of acquisition, gained control of the majority of resources in their domain. How willingly the general populace is to accept this status quo is not to be underestimated. It quite often only requires the valid threat that life could always be made worse to keep the majority in check. The level of incompetence of the ruling class and the discontent of the masses can best be shown by the number of rebellions and civil unrest throughout most of history. Quite often it could be said that civilization has progressed unabated despite the efforts of the ruling class, not because of it. The point of this light-hearted historical tirade is this. Back when the number of people was generally small, the ruling class, or society as part of a hostile world, was unable to enact and effect an artificial restriction of resources, or simply enslave or tax the masses to extract the wealth as a percentage of their labor through threat of violence, in one form or another. And these were the days where the masses didn't even expect to see any gain from their taxes, except for perhaps the hope of not being killed. What relevance does this have in modern society, you may ask? Quite simply this. Though some societies have been lucky enough to remove the worst influences of the ruling class from the realm of government to the point where the government must, at the very least, appear to serve the people, though the level of corruption in some places would make you wonder, the ruling class have still managed to maintain their hold over the control of the majority of resources in the form of capital or money. Remember, money is only a way of keeping score. It allows you to know what amount of resources or share or services you can bring under your control compared to everyone else. The artificial restriction of resources has been greatly helped by the massive jump in population. This makes it much more difficult for the average person to realize what influence the limiting of access to resources or capital by the ruling class has on their lives, as quite simply the sheer number of people on this earth now has its own limiting influence. Labor, the real only way to generate true wealth and value, still gives up a percentage of its efforts to the ruling class in one of three ways. Taxes. If you are lucky, your taxes are at least mostly going to providing services that you enjoy. The ruling class are continuously making inroads, however, to ensure more and more of these taxes are more to their benefit and less for the masses. The second is employment. If you are not your own boss, you are by default giving a section of the value of your work generated to the owner of the business for the privilege of being employed by them. It is nothing more than a system that, to a more or less degree, can exploit the worker. It is quite obvious, after all, that it is impossible to a modern society for everyone to be their own boss, beyond that of a contractor. The third is rent or interest. Due to the limiting supply of land and capital, it is necessary for most people to pay a component of their labor, or the labor of others, to the owners of this capital for the privilege of using them. How very generous of them. Knowing that all value and wealth is generated by all citizens, either through the restriction of access to resources or through labor, it should be obvious to even the most skeptical that excessive wealth in the hands of a small group of individuals is simply grossly immoral. No individual on their own, or indeed multiple generations of individuals on their own, could ever generate the type of wealth we see today in the hands of a precious few without the aid of their fellow citizens. It matters little if this wealth was inherited or acquired within the current morally accepted framework. At the end of the day, the origin of the wealth was borne by the labor of all people, and just because it is inherited or acquired off of another person will never absolve the wealth of this basic fact. Anyone with even the most basic understanding of history can appreciate that the older the money or wealth is, the more likely it is to be steeped in blood and injustice. Even modern tycoons and stock market gurus are only stealing from each other the wealth that was generated by others and never belonged to any of them. Despite the claims of hard work of the top 5% in swindling their fellow citizens out of capital, this hard work could never equate to the wealth-generating efforts of 10,000 working citizens, despite the fact that it often does in financial terms in the current system. Let me make this perfectly clear. Without society working together as a whole, without the garbage collector, the cleaner, the teacher, the factory worker, the technician, the mechanic, the driver, and everyone else, you could not have the banker, the tycoon, the stock market broker, the musician, the actor, the entertainers, the politicians, or the investment banker. And you don't have to look very hard to find people who work harder than the rest of us, receiving nothing for their toil and sweat other than a miserable existence, while others do precious little and live in opulence. And no one can dispute that the wealthy cannot do without the workers, but the workers could very well do without the excessively wealthy. A final note, to begin with a quotation. Capitalism is the occasional uneven distribution of happiness, while communism is the even distribution of misery. Winston Churchill. At this point I would just like to reiterate that I am in no way proposing that all salaries or wealth distribution should be equal. Not at all. People are not equal in ability. That is just the way things are. Some work harder, others less. There will always be rich and relatively poor, leaders and followers. What I am determined to stop is the development of the exceedingly rich and the unnecessarily grinding, extreme poverty of people who are more than willing to work. It all comes down to another concept that has fallen victim in our ever-increasing polarized society: balance. Well, we've run out of time for this episode. I hope it was entertaining, and the next episode will cover much, much more. Thank you.